Send your scariest workplace stories to us at eriecast.com/submit and rate and review Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thanks.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
They say you should separate work life and personal life, but sometimes that's not the problem, because you can date your coworkers just fine with no problems. But apparently the ghosts back at home will still have something to say. Welcome back, fellow coffee lovers. Today I've got a wonderful set of new scary work stories for you, featuring ghosts aplenty, and why one former camp counselor can never go back to the Blue Ridge Mountains. Enjoy. These are Tales from the Break Room. The Nun in Uniform, from PerrieRogers. When I was in college, I started working at a uniform store and factory. The place was divided into two places. At the front was reception, a waiting area, and the fitting rooms. At the back of the property was the factory. The place was loaded with fabrics and had rows and rows of racks with sample uniforms. The second floor of the factory was more like a balcony that looked over the racks of uniforms and fabrics. That is where the sewing machines and irons were. I usually worked at the front, taking orders, measuring clients in the fitting rooms, but sometimes I was asked to bring sample uniforms from the back or to ask my coworkers to iron some pieces of clothing or sew hems of pants. But I was rarely back there, and even less so at night. One time, though, we had an important delivery that needed to be made for the next day early in the morning. I was sent to help iron some of the clothes, so they were nice and packed for delivery. It got dark pretty soon, and only one of my coworkers and I were in the second floor ironing and packing the uniforms. When it was past 7, and we had been there for more than an hour, I started to feel dizzy, and my head felt heavy. I thought I was just getting tired. I got up and started to walk across the floor, hoping that would help me feel better. When I'd made 2 circuits around the machines, I suddenly started to feel cold. I looked down from the balcony, thinking about getting a jacket from the racks. While I was looking around to decide which jacket I could borrow, I saw from the corner of my eye some movement on the racks farthest from me. Immediately, I turned around, since no one else was supposed to be there, and down there were no windows that could cause a draft. The first floor wasn't very well lit, so I was thinking it must have been my imagination. But then I saw it. Between 2 lines of racks on the back, I saw a tall black figure. It appeared to be wearing a nun habit, complete with the headpiece and a veil on the face. I immediately jumped back and screamed. My coworker, who was just hanging some pants, looked at me and laughed. I looked at her with a terrified look on my face. "You saw her, didn't you?" she asked me. I was in shock and could only nod, no words coming out of my mouth. "Yeah, we just pretend we don't see her. It's better we don't acknowledge her or weird things start to happen," she said in a very calm voice. I was still processing what I'd seen. I looked down from the balcony again, but the figure was gone. Did I actually see something down there? I finally asked my coworker. "I can tell you you're not the first to see her. But what do you think?" she answered. I don't know. I'm definitely not staying after hours again," I said with a shaky voice. My coworker just laughed again, and we finished packing all the uniforms. I did have to stay after hours a few other times, though, but I never did look down from the balcony again. (1995) From Katrostrophic. This happened back in the summer of '95 when I was 21. I worked as a camp counselor up in the Catskills. It was my first time doing the job, and to be honest, I was mostly in it for easy money and the chance to get out of the city for a few months. One night I'm on solo overnight duty, which basically meant I had to stay up and keep an eye on the campgrounds while the kids were sleeping. It's honestly an easy assignment. Just me, a crappy little cabin, and a whole lot of peace and quiet. I was sitting on the porch, smoking a cigarette, trying to stay awake, when I started to hear this weird noise coming from the woods. At first, I thought it was the wind, maybe some nocturnal critters doing their things. But the more I listened, the more it started to sound like footsteps crunching through the underbrush. Now, I'm not exactly a nature guy, so my mind immediately jumps to the worst-case scenario. I was thinking, crap, what if it's a bear? Or maybe some crazy axe murderer? I started to low-key panic, but I'm also trying to play it cool. I'm the adult here, I reminded myself. Can't be freaking out over some random noises in the woods. But then the footsteps started to get closer, and I swear I could hear this low, guttural breathing sound, like a growl. At that point, I was pretty much crapping myself, also frozen in place. I was sitting there, white-knuckling my cigarette, waiting to see what fresh heck is about to come bursting out of the tree line. And then I spot this pair of eyes, reflecting back eye shine, staring at me from the dark. They're these big and round eyes, almost floating in midair, like some kind of disembodied forest demon. I just about soiled myself right then and right there. Finally, I scrambled to my feet, ready to run back inside and barricade the freaking door, when the thing with the glowing eyes begins to move closer. And as it steps into the moonlight, I don't see a bear, nor an axe murderer, nor a demon. It's just a freaking deer. Just a totally normal, harmless deer, probably out looking for a midnight snack. But in my paranoid, sleep-deprived state, I'd managed to convince myself that I was about to star in my own personal horror film. I felt like an idiot. The deer just kind of stared at me for a minute, probably making fun of me in its head. Then it wandered off back into the woods, like nothing ever happened. Meanwhile, I'm standing there with my heart pounding out of my chest, feeling like the biggest wuss in the world. I didn't tell any of the other counselors about it the next day, because I didn't want to look like a total wuss. But I gotta say, that was hands down the scariest thing that's ever happened to me in the woods. And I wasn't even in any actual danger. Just goes to show you how your mind can play tricks on you when you're out in the middle of nowhere, I guess. That's my story. Not exactly a brush with Bigfoot or anything, but it sure as heck felt like it was about to be one. Definitely made me rethink the whole easy money thing. From then on, I was more than happy to let someone else take over the overnight watch. In and Out, from Noon 3. Not too long after I turned 18, I moved out of my mom's place into a house in town not too far from her. I'd plans of moving with a friend, but that didn't work out, so it was just my pupper, Celine, and 2 rabbits, Footloose and Bits. I'd been working and going to school in this town for a few months before I moved. I was overjoyed to not only have a place to myself, but an actual house. It was small, but perfect to me. The house was on the older side, about 50 years old. It was coming to the end of summer when I moved in. I was used to having problems everywhere I moved, but with this house, I got to blame all the typical noises I would hear on the old house. After a couple of months of being there, I'd invited my work friend to hang out whenever we had time. He would stay the night every now and again, so he would hear the house noises too every time he stayed over. At this time of my life, I'm used to hearing footsteps, knocking, voices calling my name, and objects being moved about to places they have no business being. To me, everything that started to happen was normal. To my friend, though, he was not as used to it as I was. He had some experiences in his own life, but nowhere near this severe. The first few months were normal. I picked up a few tips and tricks over the years to deal with these types of things. But one day, I woke up to some sad news. I went to check on my bunnies, who I let run openly in the mudroom, so they had more space the night before. There was a disaster in the room, though, far too much for 2 bunnies to have done themselves. There I found Footloose, dead, with Bits huddled in a corner, shaking and terrified. The poor baby didn't want to come to me, and even ran when I got close. I moved Bits' cage to the second bedroom and cleaned everything up. These were once injured wild bunnies, and were too young to survive on their own, so I took them in and fixed them up. Footloose had been missing half of one of her back feet, and Bits had chunks torn out of her back and ears. I was so sad seeing what I found when I woke up. My friend and I were just in there with them the night before, feeding and watering them. The 2 bunnies were so happy before, having their zoomies once I let them out of the cage. About a week after that, we found Bits dead as well. This killed me. There was no way they could have just dropped dead overnight for no reason. After I discovered this, with no rhyme or reason to it, I decided to take action. I smudged the whole house with sage, and I had it blessed. For those who don't know, sage is not meant to kick spirits out, but rather put them at ease, put them to sleep, so to speak. Once I completed the smudging, I began with expelling the place. This involved putting sigils on every entry into the house, doors and windows alike. After that, I covered the sigils in herbs and oils and blessed them. I know that not many people believe in these kinds of things, but I feel that, if performed properly, it can make a big difference. The moment I'd finished with my cleansing, you could feel a weight lift from the place. The air didn't seem so thick, and I even felt lighter. For the next 3 months, we didn't have a single problem. Later on one night, I was in the living room watching TV, waiting for my friend to get off work. It was about 10 p.m., and he wouldn't be over until 11. It had been snowing that night, and there was a nice layer of snow on the ground, maybe 2 inches thick. I thought I heard what sounded like someone walking on the wooden porch in heavy boots. I was sitting on the couch with my back to the window, which led to the porch, so this startled me. I looked out the window to check, and I didn't see anyone. A few minutes later, I heard it again, so I took another look. Still, there was no one out there. I even looked down at the snow, checking for prints, but didn't find any. It happened again, and I just ignored it that time. And I think whatever it was didn't like that I ignored it, because a few minutes later, the footsteps came back, followed by a pounding on the screen door. Now, I'm a very paranoid person, so I have both the main and screen door locked at all times when I'm home. I looked out the window over to the door, and of course, saw nothing. The pounding happened again, but this time it was so hard, both doors began to shake. I went over to unlock the main door, keeping the screen one locked. No one was there, and there were no footprints on my lawn. My dog was out back, and I kept the back door open when she was out there, so I could hear her clearly, but I kept the screen shut. She's a husky, so she screams at me when she's ready to come in. This dog is the most mild-mannered husky you would ever find. She gets her zoomies and only speaks when she needs to. There's only one reason she would ever bark. That's if someone comes into her living space without me present. If I'm there, she'll stay between my legs, in front or behind me, but remain silent. After I'd locked the door back up, I heard Celine start to bark. I ran to the back and looked to see who was there. There was no one out there in the alley, nor in the yard next door. The top screen was missing from the back door, so once I was there, my dog would jump through that part to get to me without me having to open the door. So when I got there, she ran and jumped inside. I rushed to take off her line, to toss it back out the window, slamming the back door shut in the same motion and locking it. By this time, I hear the knocking on the front door again. When I go to look this time, I'm relieved. It's my friend. I quickly let him in, and I ask him if he saw anything weird outside. He replied no, and I went on with my night. About a week later, I was snuggled up with my dog, listening to some stories and about to fall asleep, when I heard a tap tap tapping coming from the window next to me. It made me jump. My first thought was that it was a branch tapping in the wind. Then it happened again, so that confirmed to me it was a tree, so I got snuggled back up. Oh, how wrong I was when the tap tap tapping came again, but this time at a completely different window, and slightly louder than before. My dog then took note of it as well, so I knew I had to stay alert. Slowly but surely, the tapping moved throughout all the windows, getting louder and louder each time. It completely circled the house before it just stopped, and everything went silent. It took me longer to fall asleep that night, but I eventually did. My friend moved in a couple of days after that and soon became my boyfriend. When spring came around, we were home alone when some guy in a pickup truck just came up, asking if I needed anyone to do lawn care. I told him no and said thanks, and that we took care of it. The grass hadn't even reached 2 inches yet, so it didn't need any work at the moment. I'd never seen that man, nor his truck, in my neighborhood before, so I made a point of remembering what they looked like. I went and told my boyfriend what happened, describing the truck to him. He had never seen it either. About a week and a half later, I was outside playing with my dog when the same truck pulled up across the street. I kept it in sight, but acted as if I was too focused on the dog. The man sat in his truck for a few minutes before getting out and walking over to me. Now, I'm a smaller person, and I do not like when someone I don't know approaches. He asked once more if I needed anyone to do yard work. I replied no, but then he asked if I lived alone. I told him yes, I did, even though I didn't. After that, he left, and I stared at him until he drove away. I told my boyfriend about what happened again, even telling him that I lied about living alone. He laughed at this. I would notice from time to time that truck just sitting across the street with someone sitting inside. There was one day that I had to work a day shift, so the two of us had to leave home around 9 a.m. I took my boyfriend to his dad's place in the next town over before heading on in. For context, my boss is my next-door neighbor. He came in about an hour after I did. He asked if my boyfriend was still at the house, and I said no. Then he said that my front door was sitting wide open since 10 a.m. But I know that I'd locked the door before I left. After learning this, I got a call from a number that I did not recognize. It was someone saying they had my dog, that she somehow just came running into their yard and sat with them. I thanked him for holding on to her and made a run to go get her with my boss. Once I got back to my house, lo and behold, both doors were wide open. The two of us went inside and went through the whole place. Nothing was missing, nothing was even out of place. So I locked back up and we went back to work. Once my boyfriend got to work, I told him what happened, and he confirmed for me that I had locked the door. This is the incident that started a domino effect. A few nights after that happened, I was awakened by a weird noise. I lifted my head up groggily and looked around. I saw the closet door rattling. It was the only thing moving, and I was tired, so I just said, "Can you not right now? I'm so tired of this bullcrap." And it just stopped. I immediately fell back to sleep. I didn't get around to cleansing the house again for a while, as I didn't really have the time to. It's a time-consuming process. Well, because of this, The normal activity began again. The footsteps, knocking, hearing my name, and objects moving around. And the closet door joined in every now and again. For that, all I had to do was ask it to stop. And for some reason, it would listen. We ended up going to a New Year's party at our boss's house. I was closing that night, so I got there late, and I was in my work uniform. We were in the garage playing beer pong, listening to music. There were only 7 of us. 3 left after a couple of hours. Since we were about 15 stumbling steps away, I wasn't watching how much I was drinking. At one point I needed to use the restroom, so I walked out of the garage and turned my head to my dining room windows to see my dog watching us. In the other window, I saw the silhouette of someone. I ran inside, tripping on the steps on the way up. When I opened the door, it was just my dog. When I went back, I told my boyfriend what I saw. He looked over, saw nothing, but said that he would keep an eye out. At one point, he went to go to the bathroom and came back. He told me that he saw something too. We eventually went home together and went to bed. Before long, we had another work friend move in with us. He moved into the second room. 2 weeks after that, I got a request to take in 2 coworkers who were living in their car for a week or 2, just until they could find a place. Then about a week after that, I got another request of the same thing. So we had a full house. The 2 girls in the living room and the other guy in the mudroom. It was me and the 2 girls in my bedroom playing a board game. We suddenly all just stopped making noise and listened, because there was this eerie but quiet voice coming from inside the bathroom. We slowly crept to the door. It sounded like a little girl calling for the name Timmy or maybe Tommy. Just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. We opened up the bathroom door, but there was no one in the bathroom. We looked at each other, then hesitantly went back to our game. Maybe 2 weeks after this, my boyfriend and I were sitting in the room watching anime and eating lunch. I was trying to share my food with my pupper, but she wouldn't come close enough to get it. I knew she really wanted it. She just wouldn't come grab it. I do spoil her, and I will normally either share my food or make her her own plate. She's an amazing dog, so she deserves it all. Seeing her act like that, I decided to record. I used Snapchat to film. Using it, I can put on a filter that makes it easier to see the unseen. I made a slow circle of the room. Once I got to the spot she refused to move to, my trash and table were there. I lingered in that area for a moment. I was just about to end the video when the outline of a face popped into view. I left it at that. We both figured it was how it picked up the trash there. We then talked about how Celine was reacting to that spot. When we said her name, the face looked towards the door, where Celine then shows up a few seconds later. Not too long after that, we moved out of that house. This will bring you to the present, what is currently happening and what had happened over the past couple of years. After we moved out of our last house, my boyfriend and I, together for 2 years at the time, moved in with his dad, as well as our pupper Celine. His dad is a disabled veteran living in a big house on his own. For both financial and personal reasons, we moved in the next town over. It's a small town with 2 gas stations and a grocery store. Not much else, other than this hotel. During the time, we also worked at a nursing facility. This will be relevant later. Now, his dad's basement was just as big as the upstairs area, mostly just an open area with 2 rooms down there. The rooms were connected, but a piece of plywood divided them. We took the smaller of the 2, as that was my boyfriend's bedroom before he moved out. It was mostly set up, so we put the spare items in the basement in the open space. The very first night we stayed, I had to get up and go to the bathroom. Now, I was already having trouble sleeping, as we just moved into the place. It was new to me, strange. I went upstairs to go to the bathroom at one point. As soon as I got to the kitchen, I saw a reflection of rotting feet standing in the doorway between the dining room and the kitchen. I thought, nope, and took the route through the gym room to the bathroom. When I got back, I saw nothing and went downstairs. The next morning, I told my boyfriend about it. He was curious, as he had never seen nor heard anything while living there before. Now, before this happened, I had come across at one point a Dybbuk box. Well, it wasn't a true Dybbuk box, but something like one. It was said to contain a spirit and followed similar rules to a Dybbuk box. If you don't know, a Dybbuk box comes from Judaism. It is created to hold an evil spirit, or a demon, commonly referred to as a Dybbuk in that culture. I knew from when I obtained it, the first thing I needed to do was find out what kind of spirit was inside. Because of this, I never allowed the box to set foot in the house to prevent anything from attaching itself. However, that did not stop it from coming inside, apparently, because I believe that is what I saw on the first night I was there, those rotting feet. Once I came to this conclusion, I expelled anything that could be in the house for the time being. After the first 2 weeks of us being there, one of our old roommates could not find a place to stay, so he moved in for a few weeks until he could secure housing. This was an uneventful few weeks, not hearing nor seeing anything. Then the day he left, he was going through things, making sure to take his items only. And then he came across the box and brought it inside. He wanted to see if it was ours. I was surprised and a bit angry. I wanted to go off on him as to what he had done. Starting the next day is when activity began again. I started getting the feeling of being watched. Even when I was home alone, I felt eyes on me at all times. His dad decided to go to the gathering of the Juggalos. It was a few states over, so he was gone for an entire month. My boyfriend and I had alternating days off, as we were the only two in our department at the time. During this time, I thought I was going insane. Anytime I was home alone, I would hear someone walking around upstairs. I'm paranoid, so I would go and sweep the upstairs for someone every time I heard it. I finally asked my boyfriend if he had any problems while he was home alone, and he said he hadn't heard a thing. His dad finally got back, and I could blame all the footsteps on him walking around the house, so I never classified anything other than what I saw the first night as truly paranormal. Though I was used to it happening my entire life, I always searched for some doubt. Now you should know we are treated like the Munsters, the three of us. We got the old rundown place at the end of the block, always clad in black, and the townspeople avoid us at all costs. We were also apparently the only house that would decorate for spooky time. The other houses would decorate for every holiday but Halloween. We really stuck out like a sore thumb in that town. We don't have people coming door to door selling or pitching anything because of this. On a random summer day, I had my mom, little siblings, and her fiancé over. We were all gathered around the living room table, playing Cards Against Humanity, when there was a loud knock on the front door. It was so loud, every last one of us jumped. His dad got up and went to take a look, only to find no one there. We continued on with our game. Eventually, like my mom always does, she brought the conversation topic to the paranormal, and she started to rant. I did mention the things I heard there, and of course how the other two never noticed it. I just tell her it's all right. Maybe I'm just going crazy. But my mom gives me this look because she knows. Suddenly, the stove timer went off. This was an older stove with one of those dial timers. We never used it. His dad never even used it a single day he had lived there. But he did mention at one point he had a problem with it going off on its own. It then became pretty common to walk in at night or early morning only for the timer to go off. Something I found out after living there a few months. His dad would typically go to a city 2 hours away every Saturday night. He had taken a break from that during his 2-month-long trip. but he was starting to go out again, and we were invited to join. We told him no the first few times he asked, but eventually we relented and went with him one Saturday. Well, it turned out that most of his friends were rock stars and rappers. He went every week to their shows. After one night, we got back early in the morning. I noticed my dog was a little more anxious than normal. She does have separation anxiety, but this seemed a lot worse than that. She refused to move out of her kennel. We never locked her in there, it's her safe space, so the door is always kept open. No matter what I did, get her toys or treats, she did not want to move from her kennel. She acted as if she was in trouble, but looking through, there was nothing out of place, so there would be no reason for her to be in trouble. I went and sat in the kennel with her, and she laid her head on me, glancing around the basement as she did. After a few minutes, I got her to come and lay in bed with me. She kept her focus on the door even after I shut it. This is the only time I've ever seen her affected this way. She is a strong girl. If she's with me, she stays behind me or between my legs, allowing me to take action for things. But if she's alone, she takes charge of things. I like watching her goof off, so I'll spy on her through the windows when she's out and about. A couple of days after this, I was off work and just got back from taking my boyfriend to work. I let her outside and I was starting laundry. She was out there for a total of 10 minutes before I heard her start to bark. This dog only barks for one reason. Any other time, she just screams at us to get our attention. The joys of owning a husky. So it really threw me off to hear her bark like that. I ran outside, and there was no one there. She doesn't just bark at random people. She only barks if someone she does not know walks onto our property without one of us around. When I found her, she was staring into the garage, so I went and took a look inside. Still no one. I went ahead and rushed her back inside. She's a beautiful dog, so I'm always afraid of someone coming and taking her. About 2 weeks after that, my boyfriend's dad told me how he had the exact same thing happen to him. He put her out, heard her barking a few minutes later, and said he was confused since he had never heard her bark like that before. He thought that maybe another dog came for a visit. When he went out, he saw nothing there, so he just brought her back inside. Since then, we got a camera so we could watch her while she's out, but it's never happened again. And that catches you up for the last couple of years. Disaster in the Forest. From Lumine. I am a travel writer for a rather well-known travel magazine. I've been to almost every country in the world. I've seen and experienced many different things in my 35 years of life. I've been at this job since the tender age of 20, and my first run-in with something bizarre has never left the forefront of my mind. I was working with local hikers in a small town in Peru. I was writing an article for the magazine about the small towns of Peru, and which ones were quite interesting and kind to travelers. I was visiting one that had beautiful hiking areas, and the locals there were all kind-hearted, but they tended to stay out of the forest. When I inquired as to why, they fell silent and had refused to answer me, but the fear in their eyes was obvious. I naturally assumed it had something to do with a predator, perhaps even a tribe of some sort that wasn't so friendly. Needless to say, the only guides I could get on these trails were people who were from a town 20 minutes away, and I had to pay a rather hefty fee. We set out around 2 o'clock in the afternoon after much talking and packing supplies, but even these guides seemed ill at ease. I noticed that the deeper we went into the forest, the darker and more dense it became. I was beginning to feel unnerved. The different sounds around me were so alien, but we eventually came to a part of the trail that was overtaken by weeds. The path just disappeared underneath a dense carpet of greenery. The air was humid, and we decided to take a small break. I looked at my watch as we rested. It was already 4. We'd been hiking for hours, and it had not seemed that long. We had camping materials with plans to settle in the forest overnight, but something nagging at my senses told me that might not be such a good idea. I was going to voice my concerns, but the guide had begun clearing his area, and so I naturally fell into the habit of helping out. Then off we went again. The guides seemed to calm down, but we were vigilant as we began the long trek through the forest, now without a path. I had no idea where we were and how we were going to get back to town, and it was then I realized how lost we truly were. If the guides were out of sight, or if they decided to abandon me, nobody would know, and I would never get out of here. We lit lanterns and continued into the night, stopping at 10 o'clock. We were exhausted by then, so we set up camp and ate some of the rations we brought with us, voicing stories to calm our nerves, and even drank some of the local beer, which was a lot stronger than I was used to. I'm almost ashamed to admit that I passed out around the campfire. The last thing I heard was the guides laughing at my expense. When I came to, it was still extremely dark, and the guides were in their tent, leaving me by the now dimmed fire. I was unnerved by how quiet the forest was. There wasn't even a sound, so I took out my notebook and began to write about my experience so far, plotting what to write in the article. I fed the fire a few branches until it was glowing cheerfully. The crackling of the fire and the sound of my pencil were the only noises then. I thought that was unusual, so I paused. My guides had not moved. I crept to their tent to try to rouse them, but realized they had gone quiet too. When I looked inside, they were gone. How long they'd been gone, I had no idea. I began to panic. All alone out here, no sense of direction. I took off with my headlamp, calling their names, calling out for anyone, with nothing more than the vague idea of where we'd come from. That was the worst idea. I would remain lost for a few days. I drank puddle water to keep me going, not sure how I never got sick. But I did manage to find the village again. I was dehydrated, starving, and exhausted, and I tried to desperately explain what happened. The locals only frowned, sitting me down and telling me of the evil spirits of the forest. But to me, I'd simply picked a terrible place to write an article about. The locals even begged me not to write about it. Going in those woods only upsets the spirits. I heard years later that the locals there banned tourists from the forest altogether after too many accidents. I was incredibly lucky myself to have made it out alive. Not sure how I really managed to stumble out of there and find the village again, but I am glad to be alive. A Lost Soul from Leendor. Of all these strange encounters I've had, there's one that really takes the cake. It always sends shivers down my spine when I think about it. Sometimes I don't know if it was meant for me to see or not, but my family believes it was fate for me to encounter this. It was 2021. I'd landed a job at a fast food joint, KFC specifically. I loved working both day or night shift. Since I was new to the place, I of course had to undergo training, but thankfully it was paid. It took place at night when it wasn't so busy. I was happy even though I had to go home late. I never had to worry about transport either since I had my own car. My training went smoothly, then I started to work normally. And for a while, nothing weird happened. A few months into the job, though, I was assigned to do overtime. One of my colleagues was on maternity leave, so we had to cover her shifts. During that period, I left around 11:45 p.m. I always passed by a filling station. There was one odd thing that I didn't at the time think was unusual. Every time I passed by there, I would see a woman hitchhiking. On this particular day, I decided to stop as it was raining and thundering out. I rolled down my window there, and I spoke to her. "Hey, I don't know where you're going, but I can't let you just get drenched in the rain. It's not safe out here." The first weird thing was, the moment I stopped, I had this feeling of unease. But I didn't take it seriously yet. Perhaps it was just anxiety with speaking to a new person. It was around 12:05 a.m. when I stopped. The young lady, who seemed to be in her mid-20s, flashed a smile at me, then got in my passenger seat. "Hi, I'm Tanisha. I need a ride home. Can you help me out?" she said in a soft and friendly voice. I flashed a smile back and said, "No need to worry. I'll make sure you get home safe and sound. Call me Leendor." I then turned on the heater and began to drive. As I drove, that feeling of unease grew stronger, and I wasn't sure why. I thought maybe I was shaken up by the strong lightning and thunder outside. But I continued on. Tanisha was quite the chatterbox. She just kept the conversation going. At one point, I lent her my jacket to help her get warm, as my heaters weren't the best. When I got to her place, it was 2:30. I dropped her off, and I waited until I saw her disappear at the corner of the house. Then I began to drive home. On my way back home, that feeling of unease was gone. I made it home around 5. It was my lucky day, as I wouldn't have to go into work that day. So I got home and went straight to bed. The following day was a Sunday, and I drove ahead to Tanisha's house. When I got there, I met someone who looked like her, but older. I introduced myself. "Hello, ma'am, my name's Leendor. Friday during the heavy rain, I gave a young lady a ride. I dropped her off right here. I'm here to pick up my jacket she borrowed." The lady turned around and started to call. "Anna, there's a young man out here claiming to have given you a lift Friday. Wants his jacket back." Anna came out with a confused look in her eyes. She didn't bother greeting. She went straight to the point. "I don't know you, man. Are you sure you gave me a ride or some girl just played you?" I was a bit shocked for a moment, before coming back to my senses and saying, "Oh, sorry, it's not you. She looked like you, but a bit older. She said her name was Tanisha?" "What?" Both the mother and daughter asked at the same time. Then the mother started to sob. She then said, "Son, did you say Tanisha?" I nodded, but she kept quiet for a moment. Then she signaled Anna with her eyes, and Anna went back inside, then came back out with a photo album. They asked again if she was the one I gave a ride to, pointing her picture out to me. I said yes. The mother went silent for a minute, before saying, "Son, I don't know what you're playing at. Tanisha died in a hit-and-run accident about 2 years ago, coming back from work. But if you truly saw her, that's not good." They checked the whole house, even her bedroom, but the jacket was nowhere to be found. I decided to forget about my jacket. I just left, but things changed because I never saw the hitchhiking Tanisha ever again. Maybe my visit to her family set her free somehow, or perhaps something they did after the fact set her free. After all, there is a traditional ceremony performed if a person died on the road or at the hospital. It is believed that it helps guide that person's soul to the right place. Sometimes they are believed to linger around and disturb the living otherwise. A week later, I came into contact with her mother. She told me they found my jacket. It was neatly placed nearby a tree next to Tanisha's grave. They told me they did the ritual to set her spirit free that night. That made me realize that sometimes we come across people who just need help. Sometimes these people don't know they're no longer alive. To this day, I refrain from driving at night or working night shifts. Don't work alone. From Elias. A year ago now, I'd worked as a camp director for an art camp located in the Blue Ridge area of North Carolina. We were open for 5 years, all summer long, and had several dozen students, many of whom were here every year. We had one of the best art programs in the area, and we had a waiting list of several dozen more potential students. We had students who learned watercolor painting, others who did sculpting, and even more who were into the most popular programs, online art and photography. I worked closely with the photography department, often taking over the classes when the teacher was gone for the day, either due to illness or complications with her pregnancy. I took these students around the woods fairly often, whenever they were in my charge. We would often spot flowers or animals in the woods, pausing with our cameras to snap a picture of the flora and fauna. I had a student in my very last class I had attended. As usual, we went to the all-too-familiar trail, but they were learning low-light photography, so we had to go in the early hours of the night. It was past curfew, but we had permission that evening. It was myself and 2 other counselors who led the night walk. We tried to be quiet so the animals wouldn't flee from us, and the students attempted and many succeeded in capturing absolutely gorgeous pictures of the night and the animals therein. One student, named Simon, captured something that halted us in our tracks. It was an image captured when he used his flash that we hadn't seen in the darkness otherwise. It was a picture of an old man, impossibly tall and pale, with a long beard that reached his chest. He had unkempt hair and a wide smile, with a gleam in his eyes. I didn't want to panic the students with the news of this intruder, so we hurriedly moved the students down the path, saying that it was getting too dark and we needed to return to camp. It wasn't long until we all picked up on the sounds of branches and leaves crunching and breaking behind us, a truly unnerving sound after what Simon had captured. We weren't sure who the person was or their intentions, but we knew they shouldn't be out here. Even worse, looking as deranged as he had, with his clothes torn, muddied, and the look in his eyes. Just on his looks alone, he was unnerving. We pushed the students a bit faster, with some of the younger ones panicking now, and the older ones nervously looking behind us as we all but ran down the path, making sure to keep an eye on everyone, not willing to let anyone stray. For a few nights after, we received word of break-ins with the camp, someone sneaking in and stealing supplies before leaving behind a dead bird or rodent in exchange. Our cameras did capture the man in question, and the police had been called multiple times before they eventually told us they couldn't find anyone after hours searching the woods, and it was probably, according to them, a homeless camper. One night in particular, we heard screaming from the woods behind Cabin 4, which had been at the farthest end of the camp. When the staff went to investigate, all we found was blood everywhere, and terrified children, with dead deer and doves plastered around the ground of the cabin. Many students went home after the incident, and unfortunately, the camp had to be closed down for safety's sake. Many parents demanded refunds, and the amount of press and negative lashback from the community kept the camp from opening again, and lawsuits ensured the camp owner never opened another one. I still have nightmares of that screaming, and the wild look in that man's eyes. I won't go back to that cabin. From Landman. I've got a rental property up in the mountains. This old run-down cabin, sitting on a few acres of dense forest. It's not the most popular of my rental properties, given the location and the general state of the place. But every now and then some city folks will rent it out for a rustic getaway. Well, a couple years back, I got a call from the latest guests. This young couple from the suburbs. They were in a total panic, saying there was something weird going on at the cabin, begging me to come check it out. I was thinking, great, Probably just a busted pipe or a raccoon in the trash, but I agreed to drive up there and take a look. I got to the property, and right away I could tell something was off. The place was dead quiet, which is strange for those woods. Whenever I was out there, I had never not heard birds chirping and leaves rustling, those kinds of things. But this, it was just a total eerie silence. I go to knock on the door, but it swings wide open before I can even touch it. The couple is standing there, wide-eyed and shaking. Once they see me, they practically yank me inside. They then start babbling about hearing weird noises coming from the woods, seeing strange shadows moving between the trees, generally just saying very odd things. I'm trying to calm them down, telling them it's probably just wildlife, or their imaginations getting the better of them. But they weren't having it. They kept insisting that there was something out there, something watching the cabin. As anyone would, I think, I was starting to get a little bit freaked out myself. But I didn't want to show it. I told them I would go out to look around the property, to see if I could find anything out of place. I stepped out onto the back porch, and right away, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There's this weird, heavy feeling out there, like the whole forest is holding its breath. I had to basically force myself to walk out into the yard, shining my flashlight into the trees. That's when I see it. I'll describe it as best I can, but believe me, it's gonna sound a bit crazy. There was this pale, vaguely human-shaped thing, darting between the trunks, moving far too fast to be a person. I saw it for just a few seconds, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. I freaking booked it back inside, slamming and locking the door behind me. The couple was huddled on the couch, looking at me expectantly, but I didn't even know what to say. I wasn't even sure I believed what I just saw, but I knew that I didn't want to stay in that cabin a second longer than I had to. Long story short, I ended up giving the couple a full refund, putting them up in a motel for the rest of their trip too. I've never been able to bring myself to go back to the cabin at night, and honestly, I'm not sure I ever will. I'd rather pay someone to do that, if it came down to it. I've owned and worked with a lot of properties over the years. I've dealt with my share of weird crap, believe me. But that night, at the cabin in those woods, that was something else entirely. Maybe it was just a trick of the light. Maybe it was my own fear getting the better of me. But all I know is that there's something deeply, fundamentally wrong with that place. Don't think I'll ever know what it was I saw. Mrs. H's House, from Geeky. As a hospice nurse, I've seen my fair share of strange and unsettling things while caring for patients in their homes. But there was one patient from a few years back whose home gives me chills whenever I think about it. I was assigned to provide in-home care for this elderly woman. I'll call her Mrs. H. She was in the late stages of terminal cancer. Mrs. H was completely bedridden and required round-the-clock assistance. So I ended up spending a lot of time at her place. It was this big old Victorian house on the outskirts of town. Now, from the moment I stepped foot in that house, something felt off. It's hard to explain, but there was just this heavy, oppressive atmosphere that seemed to hang over everything. I tried to shake it off as just nerves or the natural sadness of the situation. But as the weeks went by, I couldn't deny that there was something genuinely eerie going on. It started with little things. Doors slamming shut on their own, objects inexplicably moving from where I'd left them, those sorts of things. I'd mention it to Mrs. H, trying to laugh it off as the house settling, or my own forgetfulness. But she would always give me this knowing look, saying, "It's not the house, dear. It's them." but I didn't press her on who they were at first, figuring it was just the ramblings of a sick, elderly woman. But the longer I spent in that house, the more I began to feel like we weren't alone there. I'd be sitting with Mrs. H, reading to her or adjusting her medication, and I would swear I could feel someone watching us from the darkened corners of the room. It all came to a head one night when I was staying over to monitor Mrs. H's condition. I had just helped her to bed, and I was settling in for a long night of paperwork and hourly check-ins. The house was quiet, save for the creaking of the old floorboards and the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. Around 2 a.m., I was startled out of a half-doze by the sound of footsteps coming from the attic above Mrs. H's room. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, like someone was pacing back and forth. I sat frozen, straining my ears against the silence, but the noise had stopped as suddenly as it began. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling. But then it happened again. The unmistakable sound of footfalls, this time accompanied by a low, mournful moan that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I leapt to my feet, heart pounding, and I rushed to check on Mrs. H. She was wide awake, her eyes wide and frightened in the dim glow of the bedside lamp. "Do you hear them?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're getting restless." I didn't know what to say. I couldn't very well tell my patient that yes, I was also hearing creepy noises in the night. I tried to soothe her, to tell her it was simply the wind or the old house making its sounds. But she grabbed my hand with a surprising amount of strength and fixed me with a piercing stare. "It's not the house," she said, her voice suddenly clear and steady. "It's the ones who died here, the ones who never left. They're angry I'm still holding on, that I haven't joined them yet." I felt a chill run down my spine at her words. I knew some of the history of the house. It had been in Mrs. H's family for generations, and there had been more than a few untimely deaths here over the years. But to hear her speak about it so plainly, to claim that the spirits of the dead were lurking in the shadows, waiting for her to pass on, I didn't want to believe it. I've always been a rational person, someone who looks for logical explanations before jumping to supernatural conclusions. But the longer I sat there in the dimness of Mrs. H's room, listening to the eerie groans and thuds echoing from the empty spaces of the house, the harder it was to deny that something otherworldly was at work. From that night on, the strange occurrences only intensified. I'd find myself locked into rooms that I swore I'd left open, hear whispering voices and snatches of long-forgotten arguments drifting through the vents. And always the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes, of some dark presence stalking the halls and growing ever bolder as Mrs. H's health declined. In the end, she passed peacefully in her sleep, and I was by her side. And as much as it pains me to admit, a part of me was relieved. Not just for her sake, but for my own. Because in those final days when the veil between worlds seemed at its thinnest, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever inhabited that old house was growing impatient. After that, I told my supervisors I needed a break from hospice work for a while. The emotional toll had gotten to be too much. I haven't set foot in Mrs. H's house in years, but I still do think about it from time to time, reminding myself that whether I like it or not, there are things in this world we simply cannot explain. Sometimes we're just along for the ride. Thanks for tuning in to Tales from the Break Room. the home of the scariest true work stories. If you want to hear your story narrated by me, send it to me at eriecast.com/submit. We pay 5 cents per word for accepted stories. Help us grow by leaving Tales from the Break Room a rating and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And be sure to follow us on your favorite podcast app. Check out eriecast.com or search for EerieCast on those very same podcast apps to see our other exciting and terrifying podcasts, like Unexplained Encounters, the other show I host, where I read stories with a focus on the supernatural. To get some merch, go to eriecast.store. And to unlock ad-free episodes of your favorite EerieCast shows and exclusive audiobooks, go to eriecast.com/plus and consider signing up for EerieCast Plus. You can follow me on Twitter, I guess it's X now, at Dark Prevails. You can also subscribe to me on YouTube, where I deliver the same content. Just look for Darkness Prevails. Good night. I hope we can share another break sometime soon.